There's a hypothesis called the protein leverage hypothesis that one of the reasons that we're getting fatter is because we've deprioritized protein. Our brain wants to find its protein target. So if we haven't made the target, we will be hungry and our brain will go looking for sources of protein somewhere else. I think we've got too much of a good thing. I think it's the combination of food abundance and the fact that we have very sedentary lifestyles, which showed that you could explain our current rate of weight gain and obesity epidemic by just ingesting 7 calories more per day over and above your maintenance level of calories. I think the new weight loss drugs, the new GLP-1 analog drugs, are actually proving that.
Well, Dr. Miller, you are on record as saying that every single nation is getting fatter, but some nations are getting fatter more quickly than others.
Yes, dogs and cats are getting fatter, birds are getting fatter, bigger. Human feet are getting bigger, human breasts are getting bigger. There's something out there that is encouraging it, and it's probably not one thing. I'm sure it's something synergistic. But I have to be honest, I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows exactly the reasons.
So as far as the consumption of the human diet, which may be a contributory factor to the obesity epidemic, you've also said that it isn't necessarily a case of education about diet, because people are more educated now about our diets and about food and nutrition than we've ever been before.
That's a really good point, because if you look at the people who should be most educated with respect to diet, it's people with diabetes, because they've had one-to-one instruction with dietitians and diabetes educators. And basically they are told to eat a healthy diet. It's not that different from the guidelines that everybody has been given to eat a healthy diet. And yet we know that they're not particularly much better than anyone else at following instructions. So it's very hard to change food habits. You can imagine if you were born in China and rice was part of your diet for breakfast, lunch and dinner, I don't think you'd be happy to eat a Mediterranean diet, even if it was the healthiest diet and it would help prevent diabetes or treat diabetes. I think culture and food habits as children are really important parts of people's psyche that gives them pleasure, that gives them dopamine hits, I call them. So much to do with food every day is how we enjoy our lives. And telling us to restrict something, to limit something, to feel guilty when we succumb, I think is setting up children and teenagers in particular, teenage females, up for eating disorders. And eating disorders are very common in people with type 1 diabetes. So I think we have to be very careful with nutrition guidelines. And in Australia, the first guideline is enjoy your diet, enjoy what you eat. And I really think no matter what else people do, it must be enjoyable.
Well, you've mentioned children there. You have also spoken about a bad diet starting at conception. So if we look at some of the figures, and they are stark, 1 in 5 children globally are obese, 2 in every 3 men are obese, and 1 in every 2 women are obese. But it's that 1 in 5 children being obese that is really horrifying.
It's absolutely shocking, the statistics. But I don't think you can blame everybody for what's happening. I think it's a bit like fertilizing a plant. If you give it more nutrients, you give it all the micronutrients it needs, and perhaps you give it more than enough, then it will grow bigger than a plant that hardly gets any. And I think what happens today is, especially in countries like Australia and the UK, is that we have food abundance. Food is cheaper than it's ever been as a proportion of our total incomes. And it's possible to eat on, I think, more than enough of a very enjoyable diet on about 15% of your income. And that's pretty amazing. And I think we in some ways, we have to congratulate the food industry for making food in such abundance and so pleasurable. And for most people, it is microbiologically very safe. And not many people in developed countries can say that they lack calories. And that is a credit to the food industry for producing, high-yielding crops. So I think we've got too much of a good thing. I think it's the combination of food abundance and the fact that we have very sedentary lifestyles. So they're lifestyles where we're kind of forced to sit for very long periods of time. We don't get up very often. We work in offices, many of us, and we might be sitting for hours and hours before we get up and have a cup of tea. And I think that's part of the reason. It's like they say, sitting is the new tobacco. And I think there's some truth in that. Sitting is the new tobacco. And I know myself, it's very easy at the end of the day, you've had dinner, you sit down and you watch Netflix for 2 or 3 hours. It's so easy. If you're tired, if your brain is tired, you're physically tired, then there's something to occupy your brain very easily for sitting, lying down in my case, for 2 or 3 hours on the couch. So I think that's part of the reason, but it's really it's really just setting the scene for obesity. I think, in my mind, having read what I've read lately, I think there's something to be said for the forever chemicals that are accumulating in people's blood and bodies. These forever chemicals are used in plasticizers and plastics, and it's not just food, it's toys and furniture, and we just can't get away from them. And although they might be perfectly innocent in small doses, the fact is we're all touching them all day. For example, at the moment, I'm touching the carpet. I know it's a synthetic carpet, and I know it's got these forever chemicals in them, and children are growing up with them in their bloodstream, and they're endocrine disruptors. We know that infertility is more and more common. We know that IVF therapy is needed more and more by women, that endometriosis is very common and has been ignored. And all these things point to some sort of endocrine or hormonal disruption. And one of the consequences might be obesity. So I think nobody in particular is to blame. I think we have to all put our heads together and work out how we can replace plasticizers with things that are not as dangerous.
Well, coincidentally enough, talking of forever chemicals, I watched a terrific movie recently. It's not new. It's called Dark Waters, starring Mark Ruffalo, which was based on a true story where an American company that makes these non-stick chemicals for cooking utensils, these are forever chemicals. Well, this company was taken to court by a lot of the locals in a particular rural area of America because the water in the area, in the rivers and the streams, was contaminated by these forever chemicals, and these locals became sick as a result. So it's really interesting that you mention it there now. And so you're of the opinion that the chronic disease epidemic that we see across the world, that chronic metabolic dysfunction, which manifests itself as diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, cancer, obesity, all of those things isn't as a result of just one thing. It's because of diet, it's because of exercise and these environmental pollutants that you mentioned earlier.
Yep, and probably stress and sleep, deprivation, poor sleeps, disrupted sleep. I think I know in my own personal life, I've been a bit of an insomniac all my life, and I know I found it really hard to do a full day's work some days because my brain didn't get the recharging that it needed. And I think that makes you hungry when you're tired and you are trying to cope with a full load of work or full load of, 2-year-olds that are screaming and things like that. Whatever you do, it's hard and it makes you hungry. And one of the ways you cope is by eating. Just has to be a little bit more than, it doesn't have to be gluttony. It doesn't, they're the Kevin Hall. I don't know whether you've interviewed Kevin Hall, but he's the mathematician that's done a lot of work on the maths behind the obesity epidemic. And he published a paper in The Lancet in 2011, which showed that you could explain our current rate of weight gain and obesity epidemic by just ingesting 7 calories more per day over and above your maintenance level of calories. 7 a day, which is 50 a week. It's not even half an apple. It is responsible. You see, because when we gain weight, we actually need more food to carry the heavier weight around. So some of the calories that have been laid down actually help you to use more energy. But what happens is, as you gain more and more weight and you become more and more uncomfortable with exercise or moving, then you find it very hard to move at all in some cases. It's a bit like pregnancy. I keep coming back to pregnancy because I think it's a little microcosm of how easy it is to gain weight, because the average woman gains 13 kilograms from the end of the first trimester to delivery. It's about 26 weeks and they gain 13 kilograms. That's an amazing rate of weight gain. And if you talk to women and ask them, did you eat much more in pregnancy? Will scratch their heads and say, no, I don't think I ate that much more. We did a meta-analysis, which is a sort of an umbrella study looking at what studies had recorded food intake in the first trimester and the third trimester. And what we found was that the difference in energy intake was actually quite trivial. It was not the 1,000 kilojoules a day that's recommended. It's not the 1,000 kilojoules extra a day that is calculated and recommended for pregnant women. And that's because they've done, Kevin Hall has proven this, they've done the maths incorrectly. So the message behind that is that it's very easy to gain weight, and it's a vicious cycle because in the end it makes it more difficult to move and exercise and do the things that might help you lose weight.
And then I think probably further complicating the situation is how the information is fed to us. I remember a few years ago, low fat was all the rage, and that's been challenged since. So can you talk to me about how you view that information is disseminated to us? Because it leads to so much confusion on overweight, on weight gain, weight loss, on exercise, all of these things.
Yes, and I think that to some extent professionals are to blame for the confusion. I think we've done the best under the circumstances, but I think the new weight loss drugs, the new GLP-1 analog drugs, are actually proving that it's not the food, it's the appetite. It's not the composition of the food, it's the appetite. And if you think of an appetite as like the dial on a volume control that you can turn up and down, then this volume control is turned down by these new weight loss drugs. And people are not as hungry. They don't have the same, they call it food noise in their head. They're not as interested in eating. And in fact, one of the very interesting side effects, you could call them, is that they're not as interested in smoking or is not as interested in alcohol if you've got an addiction. And this is surprising people. It's really proof that obesity is a biological phenomenon that we don't understand why their appetite dial is turned up. And just by simply turning it down, they lose weight, and they lose it quite rapidly. And just like blood pressure, it comes down, but if you stop the drug, whether it's hypertensive drug, then the blood pressure goes back up. So these drugs may be something people have to take for life. Maybe the brain of people who've gained a lot of weight, maybe as children, maybe as adults, is just different. And perhaps it's had something at conception that has caused their appetite to be higher. Just like, we're all different. Our brains are all different, and we don't understand all the environmental factors that have gone into making us all as individual as we are.
And I would think then that this is not great news for people who are getting older, because is it not the case that you need more calories, you need more sustenance as you age?
I'm not sure about that. Actually, I think we maybe as we get older, when we're not as in control of appetite. But once we get very old, actually, people become frail, and frail is the main reason they die. They die because they're not eating enough, and the women that have been heavier during their middle life or earlier in their life are the ones who don't get osteoporosis. So I think there's a happy medium there somewhere, and I talk about this a lot in nutrition, that moderation is such a key word, because when they say limit something, when they say restrict, I think a lot of people interpret that as I've got to eat as little as possible. But in fact, I think if they say eat a moderate amount, I think the message comes across as it's okay to eat this, just don't go overboard. And that applies, I think, to sugar and fat and eggs and meat and everything else that's on our palatable plate, or even when it comes to things like exercise and sleep. So, we know that red meat, particularly processed red meat, might be related to cancer. But maybe, there's not proof. But, we also know that red meat is also, in small amounts, a very good source of highly absorbable iron. And iron deficiency anemia is the most common micronutrient deficiency in the world. It affects women in particular. It affects newborn babies' brains in particular. So the message should not be avoid red meat. To me, the message is have a little bit of red meat frequently. And I apply that message to eggs and everything else that we've demonized to sugar in particular. I see sugar as something, and I'm studying and looking at this at the moment, that sweetness is extremely important to human beings. We start off as newborn babies drinking a milk that's sweeter than any other mammal milk. And that's because of its lactose content is higher than any other mammal's milk. And this is because that baby's brain is huge. It's much bigger than any other animal's brain, and it is needing that source of glucose to fuel its energy, to fuel it, to also grow. And I see sweetness as being something that we evolved genetically. We have taste receptors that we now know, not just on our tongue. They go all throughout the gut. Our gut knows when we've had carbohydrates. It knows when it's had glucose and sweetness. And I think it comes back to this very large, demanding brain of ours, 7 times bigger than it should be for our body size. And it runs on glucose. It's fuel, it's petrol, it's glucose. And the sources originally were fruits and berries. And they were available all year round, even though fresh fruit might be available only for a short season. Some fruit was ripening at different times to another fruit. And the cleverest monkeys worked out exactly where in the forest were the best, ripest fruits. We developed colour vision as a result to distinguish red and green to the ripest fruit from the leaves. And we got so much fruit that we didn't need any capacity to synthesize vitamin C, so it got dropped. And also, when we learned to cook, we began cooking starchy foods like potatoes and tubers and yams from underground. And eventually we started to cook grains and other legume type beans and pulses that must be cooked in order to be edible. We can't eat a raw potato. We will end up with a blocked intestine. If we eat a raw legume, even one bean might cause toxic effects like vomiting. So once we learned to cook, which is probably somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million years ago, we started eating starchy foods. And starchy foods are just another source of millions of glucose molecules. And we developed enzymes in the mouth that are starch digesting enzymes in saliva. And our genes have changed as a result. So this gene that produces salivary amylase, that breaks down starch, we have duplicated it. Chimps have 1 copy. We have up to 20 copies of this gene that produces salivary amylase. And it kickstarts the digestion of starch. And that makes for a glucose rise in the bloodstream that's probably faster than any fruit or vegetable. Or fruit. So potatoes enter the bloodstream faster and go to a higher glucose level than does the equivalent amount of carbohydrate in an apple, for example. So in my mind, starchy foods, sugary foods, carbohydrate foods are part of our genetic inheritance, and we should honor that. We should allow them in the moderate amounts that we ate in the past.
And I think moderate being the key word here, I think that you want to emphasize. Let's move to protein. I know you're a fan of prioritizing the consumption of protein.
Yes, we do. Sometimes we eat so much carbohydrate or so much fat that protein's taking a back seat. And protein is very satiating. And there's a hypothesis called the protein leverage hypothesis by Stephen Simpson and David Raubenheimer in Australia. And they have hypothesized that one of the reasons that we're getting fatter is because we've deprioritized protein, and we're eating carbohydrate foods in excess, fatty foods in excess, and they believe that every day our brain wants to find its protein target. So if we haven't made the target, we will be hungry, and our brain will go looking for sources of protein somewhere else. But if all these protein sources are dilute, if they've got lots of calories, for example, they're not nuts or meat, maybe they're French fries, maybe they're soft drinks, then we're not getting towards that target. So inevitably, we will be hungry until we find and meet that target. So that's one other reason why we've got this spaghetti junction when it comes to the causes of obesity. But I honestly think no one knows, that we've all got our pet hypotheses at the moment, and they're being changed. These hypotheses have to change weekly and daily because of new findings.
And those findings are coming all the time. Indeed, plenty of interesting findings in your own book, which is called New Glucose Revolution. Dr. Jennie Brand-Miller, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I loved our conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Happy Habit Podcast. If you enjoyed it or any of the previous videos, show your support. It's free. You can like, subscribe, and tell other people about this podcast series. In the meantime, check out this other video right here. And until next time, stay happy.